Working at a French hospital in Algeria during the War of Independence, psychiatrist Frantz Fanon found himself in an impossible position. In the morning, he treated French soldiers and officers who carried out torture to suppress the anti-colonial resistance. In the evening, he treated the Algerian torture victims, the very people those same soldiers had brutalized. Fanon became responsible for treating the psychological distress of the French soldiers and officers who carried out torture, as well as treating Algerian torture victims. One case haunted him. A European police inspector, referred to as R, came seeking treatment because he had begun beating his wife and children at home. He asked Fanon to help him continue torturing Algerian patriots without any prickings of conscience, without any behavior problems, and with complete equanimity. At that moment, Fanon realized, you cannot heal minds in a system designed to destroy them. You cannot cure individuals in a society that is itself sick. And so, Frantz Fanon made a choice. He would no longer be a psychiatrist for the colonial system. He would become a revolutionary for its destruction. This is the story of how a man dedicated to healing became convinced that liberation requires force. July 20th, 1925. Fort-de-France, Martinique, a French colony in the Caribbean. Frantz Omar Fanon was born into a middle-class black family, descendants of enslaved Africans who had worked the sugar plantations. His father, Felix Casimir Fanon, was a customs inspector. His mother, Eleanor Medalis, who was of Afro-Caribbean and Alsatian descent, was a shopkeeper. The family occupied a social position within Martinican society that could qualify them as part of the black bourgeoisie. Members of this social stratum tended to strive for assimilation and identification with white French culture. Fanon was raised in this environment, learning France's history as his own. He attended Lycée Sculpture, where he had a teacher who would change his life, Césaire, the great poet and theorist of negritude, a movement that celebrated blackness, African heritage, and rejected the idea that European culture was superior. Césaire taught young Frantz to see himself differently, not as someone who should aspire to be French, but as someone with his own heritage, his own dignity, his own power. Fanon was raised learning France's history as his own, until his high school years when he first encountered the philosophy of negritude, taught to him by Césaire. Then came World War II. After the Battle of France resulted in the French Third Republic capitulating to Nazi Germany in July 1940, Martinique came under the control of French Navy elements loyal to the collaborationist Vichy regime. Fanon later described the Vichy regime in Martinique as taking off their masks and behaving like authentic racists. In January 1943, at just 17 years old, Fanon fled Martinique during the wedding of one of his brothers and traveled to the British colony of Dominica to link up with other Allied sympathizers. He joined the Free French forces to fight the Nazis. He believed he was fighting for freedom. But what he found was that even the Free French were not free from racism. Fanon fought in Morocco, Algeria, and France. He was wounded in battle and awarded the Croix de Guerre, a war medal for bravery. But the medal didn't protect him from racism. Black soldiers were treated as inferior by their white comrades. The very people they were dying alongside refused to see them as equals. Fanon was disillusioned. He found the Free French no less biased against people of color than those in the Vichy regime. He had risked his life for France, and France responded with contempt. After the war, Fanon returned to Martinique briefly, then went back to France in 1947 to study medicine. He specialized in psychiatry at the University of Lyon, absorbing philosophy, existentialism, and psychoanalysis. But France, post-war, was still deeply racist. As a black man walking the streets of Paris, Fanon was stared at, feared, exoticized, reduced to his skin color. He wrote about one particular moment that crystallized everything: a white child on a train, pointing at him, screaming to his mother in terror, "Mama, look, a Negro! I'm scared!" In that instant, Fanon realized he was not seen as a man. He was seen as a thing, an object, a threat. And so, he began to write. Pause for emphasis. In 1952, at just 27 years old, Fanon published his first masterpiece, Black Skin, White Masks. The book is written in the style of autoethnography. Fanon shared his own experiences while presenting a historical critique of the effects of racism and dehumanization on the human psyche. What prompted him to write it? Pain. Humiliation. The desperate need to understand why he, a brilliant, educated, French-speaking black man, was still treated as less than human in the country he had fought to defend. Fanon examined how colonized black people internalized the values of a white-dominated world, adopting its language, its desires, its standards, while still being denied full belonging. He analyzed how language itself was a tool of oppression. To speak a language is to assume a culture and a civilization, he wrote. When a black man speaks perfect French, he is not rewarded with equality. He is merely allowed closer proximity to whiteness, never full acceptance. He dissected how black people were taught to hate themselves, to see their own skin as ugly, to desire whiteness in their partners, their children, their futures. He wrote, "The Negro enslaved by his inferiority and the white man enslaved by his superiority alike behave in accordance with a neurotic orientation. Racism," Fanon argued, wasn't just a social problem. It was a psychological sickness that infected both the oppressor and the oppressed. The book was hailed for its scientific analysis and poetic grace when it was first published in 1952. It established Fanon as a revolutionary thinker. But most importantly, it gave colonized people language to understand their own suffering. You are not crazy for feeling like you don't belong in your own skin. The system is designed to make you feel that way. But Fanon didn't stop at diagnosis. He believed in cure. And the cure, he was beginning to realize, would require more than therapy. It would require revolution. In 1953, Fanon was appointed head of the psychiatry department at Blida-Joinville Hospital in Algeria, which was then part of France. Algeria wasn't just a French colony. It was considered part of France itself, with over 1 million white French settlers living there, controlling the land, wealth, and power while the Arab and Berber majority lived in poverty and oppression. While treating both Algerians and French soldiers, Fanon began to observe the effects of colonial violence on the human psyche. He treated Algerian men who had been tortured by French police. He treated Algerian women who had been raped during interrogations. He treated French soldiers suffering nightmares from the atrocities they had committed. And then came that moment. The French torturer asking to be fixed so he could continue his work. Fanon realized, under colonial conditions, psychotherapy itself, that is, adjustment to the colonial norm, was ultimately a form of oppression. You cannot help a tortured man adjust to a society that will torture him again. You cannot cure trauma when the source of trauma is the entire social structure. In 1954, the Algerian War of Independence exploded. The National Liberation Front, FLN, with Ahmed Ben Bella as one of its key founding leaders, launched an armed rebellion against French colonial rule. Fanon had a choice: remain neutral as a doctor, or take sides as a human being. He chose humanity. In 1956, Fanon resigned from his position and joined the FLN. He didn't just join, he became one of its most important voices. He became an editor of the FLN's newspaper, El Moujahid, published in Tunis. Through El Moujahid, Fanon used his voice and writing to awaken the consciousness of Algerians and Arabs across North Africa. He wrote articles explaining why violence was necessary, why compromise with colonialism was impossible, why liberation could only come through revolutionary struggle. He wasn't just writing theory. He trained FLN members in techniques for resisting torture. He traveled to their camps from Mali to the Sahara. He gave refuge to other fighters. He trained nurses to dress wounds. The psychiatrist had become a soldier. The writer had become a strategist. He survived assassination attempts in Morocco and Libya. In 1959, he was attacked on the Algeria-Morocco border and severely wounded. But Fanon didn't stop. He couldn't. Too many people were counting on him. In 1960, he was appointed ambassador to Ghana by Algeria's FLN-led provisional government, working to secure African support for the revolution. April 7th to 10th, 1960. Accra, Ghana. The International Conference on Positive Action for Peace and Security in Africa, organized by President Osagyefo, Kwame Nkrumah's Bureau of African Affairs. The conference carried added urgency. France had just performed its first nuclear tests in the Sahara on February 13, 1960. France was literally testing nuclear weapons on African soil. Meanwhile, African resistance to settler colonialism in South Africa and Algeria was intensifying. Frantz Fanon stood before the assembled African leaders and liberation movements. He delivered a speech that would echo through history. Pourquoi nous employons la violence? Why we use violence? His voice was calm but burning with conviction. He honored Kwame Nkrumah, saying all the concerns of Africa had been tackled with mastery in Kwame Nkrumah's speech. But then Fanon addressed the elephant in the room: violence. Fanon explained that colonial violence came first. The colonizer brought violence, the violence of dispossession, of humiliation, of torture, of murder. He argued, this violence of the colonial regime irreparably provokes the birth of an internal violence in the colonized people. In other words, we are not violent by nature. We are responding to violence that has been inflicted upon us for centuries. He told the conference. His presence in Ghana as official representative of Algeria's provisional government, with the Algerian flag flying over Accra, proved that the government and people of Ghana supported the Algerian people and believed in their victory. The speech was a masterclass in revolutionary rhetoric. Fanon didn't apologize for violence. He contextualized it. He made it clear, when all peaceful means are denied, when your humanity is systematically crushed, when your children are killed and your land stolen, resistance becomes not just justified but necessary. And the audience understood. Liberation movements across Africa heard Fanon's message loud and clear. But Fanon was racing against time. Something was growing inside him. Something he couldn't fight with words or weapons. By 1960, after completing a massive intelligence operation from Mali to Algeria, Fanon was diagnosed with leukemia. He was 35 years old. He was dying. But he had one more book to write. The most important book. His testament to the colonized world. The Wretched of the Earth was written in a period of 10 weeks during 1961. Fanon didn't write it. He dictated it, racing against death, desperate to leave his final thoughts about what he had seen in Africa and the Algerian Revolution. What prompted him to write this book? The book was written in 1960 during the Algerian War of Independence, addressing the history of colonization and the contemporary crisis of decolonization. But it was more than that. Fanon had seen the future, and it terrified him. He had traveled across newly independent African nations and witnessed something horrifying: corruption, ethnic division, racism, and economic dependence on former colonial states resulting from what Fanon called the mediocrity of Africa's elite leadership class. The colonial masters were gone, but colonialism remained. New African leaders were simply replacing white oppressors, enriching themselves while their people starved. Independence without liberation. Freedom in name only. The Wretched of the Earth was Fanon's warning and his roadmap. Written at the height of the Algerian War, it analyzed the role of class, race, national culture, and violence in the struggle for freedom. Fanon drew on many ideas he had developed in his earlier writings, providing a handbook for decolonization. The book's most famous chapter, concerning violence, argued that colonial violence had dehumanized the colonized so thoroughly that counter-violence was not just strategic but psychologically necessary, a cathartic process of reclaiming one's humanity. Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous French philosopher, wrote a preface supporting Fanon's advocacy of violence by the colonized against the colonizer, calling it necessary for their mental health and political liberation. But Fanon's book wasn't just about violence. It was about building new nations, new cultures, new forms of humanity that rejected both colonialism and the European models that claimed to be universal. He wrote, "Europe has failed. Its humanism was a lie. The colonized must create something entirely new." In 1961, Fanon was carried to the United States for leukemia treatment. Upon his arrival, he contracted pneumonia, and on December 6, 1961, at just 36 years old, Frantz Fanon died in Bethesda, Maryland. He had reviewed the page proofs of The Wretched of the Earth in September. Only 3 months later, he was gone. His body was returned to Algeria, the country where he had obtained citizenship, and he was honored with a hero ceremony before being buried in an FLN veterans' graveyard near the Algerian-Tunisian border. The revolutionary had finally come home. Although Algeria gained its independence in 1962, just months after his passing, Fanon never lived to see the liberation he had fought so tirelessly to achieve. Yet, his words, his ideas, and his revolutionary fire lived on. Frantz Fanon lived only 36 years, but in that brief life, he accomplished what most people couldn't in a century. He gave colonized people a mirror to see their own oppression clearly. He gave them language to name their pain. He gave them permission to fight back. Black skin, white masks exposed how colonialism warps the mind, making the oppressed hate themselves and worship their oppressors. The Wretched of the Earth provided a blueprint for liberation, warning that political independence without economic and psychological decolonization is meaningless. After Fanon's death, as African nations gained independence, David Macy wrote, "Fanon had spoken of setting Africa ablaze, and it was on fire. Liberation movements across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and even within the United States, the Black Panthers, Steve Biko in South Africa, all drew inspiration from Fanon's revolutionary vision. His work transcended Algeria. It became the intellectual foundation for anti-colonial struggles worldwide. But perhaps Fanon's greatest legacy is this: he restored dignity to the oppressed. He said, "You are not inferior. You are not crazy. The system is sick, not you, and you have every right, every moral imperative, to destroy that system and build something better." Fanon believed that violence could be redemptive when used to reclaim one's humanity from those who sought to strip it away. You may agree or disagree with that argument, but you cannot deny its power, its honesty, its unflinching confrontation with the reality of colonial brutality. He once wrote, "Each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it, in relative opacity." Fanon discovered his mission, to be the voice of the voiceless, the analyst of oppression, the prophet of liberation. He fulfilled it. Even as his body failed, even as death approached, he kept writing, kept fighting, kept believing in a world where all human beings could live with dignity. And if you want more stories like this, stories of revolutionaries who dared to challenge empire, subscribe to the channel now. Remember, organize, resist, be unbreakable.